So we are continuing our study through the Bible, verse by verse. We're now in Genesis chapter 33. And real quickly, for the last 3 or 4 chapters, we've been talking nearly exclusively about Jacob. He stole the birthright from his father, from his brother, and then deceived his father and got the blessing. That was in chapter 27. 28 is where he had to leave, because in Genesis chapter 27, verse 41, Esau said that he was waiting until his father Isaac died, and then he was going to kill Jacob. And so Jacob had to flee for his life. He had an encounter in the 28th chapter with the Lord, but he didn't know the Lord at that time. He said, if these things come to pass, then God will be my God. And so beginning with chapter 29 all the way through 32 is describing, actually through 31, Genesis 29 through 31 is describing the 20 years that Jacob spent in Syria with his uncle Laban, who deceived him and changed his wages 10 times. It took his wife that he had worked for 7 years and actually gave the sister to Rachel, the one that he wanted. And anyway, we've already covered all of those things. He's worked for Laban for 20 years. He's now been told by God to go back. Laban came, and it could have been a really bad situation, but God intervened with a dream and protected Jacob through it. And now Jacob is beginning to face his brother. And in the 32nd chapter, he sent messages to his brother Esau that he was returning back home. And Esau came with 400 men. So that's the way that it begins here in Genesis chapter 33. And in verse 1, it says, And Jacob lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau came, and with him 400 men, and he divided the children unto Leah and unto Rachel and unto the 2 handmaidens. And so as I said, this was because Esau had threatened to kill Jacob, and it looked like that he was coming to do that with these 400 men. And Jacob had just had this encounter where he encountered a host of angels, and then he wrestled with the men. We don't know exactly all the details. Let me say, I don't know exactly all the details. Some people believe it was a pre-incarnate manifestation of Jesus. Other people call it an angel, but nonetheless, Jacob had one of the most significant encounters of his life, where his name was changed from Jacob unto Israel, and that was a significant encounter. And you'll find out here in the 33rd chapter that he didn't immediately refer to himself as Israel. He had another encounter with the Lord after his children had wiped out an entire area, and he feared for his life and had to flee. He went back to Bethel, and at that time the Lord had another significant encounter with him, and from that time on he reminded him and said, your name is Israel, and he told him to start going by Israel, and from that time on he started using that name. So here in the second verse, Genesis 33:2, it says, And he put the handmaidens and their children foremost, and Leah and her children after, and Rachel and Joseph hindermost. And he passed over before them and bowed himself to the ground 7 times until he came near to his brother. And I've already mentioned this in previous teachings, but Jacob had been a scoundrel. He had treated his brother terrible. He had stolen everything from his brother. He exalted himself at his brother's expense. And 20 years later, he was a changed man. And now here he is humbling himself and bowing himself down, not just out of fear of being killed, but his heart had been changed. He was now recognizing, in the previous chapter, when he approached this situation and he was praying, he says, God, I don't deserve this. He says, I don't deserve the least of your mercies. I don't deserve anything that you've done. So this wasn't just, bowing down to save his life or something like that. This is actually a changed heart, and it's reflected in the way that he presented himself to his brother. And in verse 4, it says, And Esau ran to meet him and embraced him and fell on his neck and kissed him, and they wept. Now, again, Esau said in chapter 27, verse 41, Genesis 27:41, that he was going to kill Jacob. And here he came with 400 men. It looks like that was his intent, but I mean, God used these gifts, and somehow or another God softened his heart. And this is an absolute miracle that Esau embraced him and they wept as they embraced each other. Boy, this is miraculous, and sometimes we just skip over things like this, but this is something that had been brewing for at least the last 20 years, and it was actually longer than that when he bought his birthright from him and stuff. So there had been animosity between them for decades, and it just instantly changed. This was really a confirmation that God was blessing Jacob. In verse 5, it says, he lifted up his eyes and saw the women and the children. It's talking about Esau's the one that saw that, and said, who are those with thee? And he said, the children which God hath graciously given thy servant. Then the handmaidens came near, they and their children, and they bowed themselves. And Leah also with her children came near and bowed themselves. And after came Joseph near and Rachel, and they bowed themselves. Now Jacob had one more child, Benjamin, through Rachel, but she died in childbirth. That will be recounted here shortly. So at this time he only had 11 sons. It doesn't tell us how many daughters he had. And so these are the ones that presented themselves to their uncle Esau. And in verse 8 it says, and he said, what meanest thou by all this drove which I meant? And he said, these are to find grace in the sight of my Lord. And Esau said, I have enough, my brother. Keep that thou hast unto thyself. Again, we can read through this real quickly, but if you really get yourself into this story and think about it, they had been fighting with each other from the time that they were in the womb. If you go all the way back to their birth, they actually strove with one another. And Rebekah said she was experiencing this fighting going on between these twins in her womb. And the Lord spoke to her and he says, there's two nations in your womb and they're fighting against each other, and the younger will have dominance over the older. So they had been fighting since in the womb. At this time, Jacob was 97 years old. I've already established that in previous things. It's hard for me to establish these things every time I say it, and so you'd have to get my living commentary to go back and see the logic behind all of that. But they were 97 years old at this time, and they had been in constant strife for nearly 100 years, and yet, boom, just like that, they were changed. And here's Jacob, who had taken advantage of his brother time after time after time, now giving him the equivalent probably of hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars worth of cattle and all these things that he gave. I mean, instead of abusing his brother, here he is giving to him. And so this is just a miraculous thing. One of the things that we can learn through this, I keep saying this over and over, but you don't need to just read the Bible as something that happened 4,000 or 5,000 years ago and think about that. You need to make application to yourself. But if God could reconcile these brothers who had hated each other to the point that one had vowed to kill the other, and this had been going on for nearly 100 years, and yet, boom, like that, it changes, and they hug each other, and they weep, and they're willing to give everything they've got to bless the other instead of take advantage. If God could do that in their lives, God can do that today. So if you have a relationship, maybe with a sibling or a child or a parent or any other relationship, and it just seems impossible. I don't think you can get much more impossible than this relationship was, and yet God turned it around. And so if God did that for them, He's no respecter of persons. He'll do it for us. And so that's one of the lessons that you can learn from this. Man, this just blesses me. And again, this is the reason that the Word of God is so alive to me, because I'm not just reading a story about something from thousands of years ago. I'm reading something and applying it to my life and seeing how this was supernatural. This isn't just these gifts that changed everything. It was God that touched Esau's heart. It was God that changed Jacob and allowed him to humble himself. And so if God did it then, He can do it now. In verse 10, it says, Jacob said, Nay, I pray thee, if now I have found grace in thy sight, then receive my present at my hand, for therefore I have seen thy face as though I had seen the face of God, and thou wast pleased with me. You know, for the 20 years that he had been gone with Laban, and then for the few days that he had been headed back home and hearing that Esau was coming with 400 people with him, he had been dreading the worst. And here he is seeing that instead of the negative, it was an absolute miracle the way the Lord turned it around. And he was just so blessed and so pleased with this. that in the next verse he says, "Take, I pray thee, my blessing that is brought to thee, because God hath dealt graciously with me, and because I have enough." And he urged him, and he took it. And so again, this is a great miracle. If God did it then, he can do it now. In verse 12 it says, "And he said, Let us take our journey, and let us go, and I will go before thee." This is Esau speaking. "And he said unto him, My Lord knoweth that the children are tender, and the flocks and herds with young are with me, and if I should overdrive them one day, all the flock will die." So that was Jacob speaking in this 13th verse. And so he goes on to say, "Let my Lord, I pray thee, pass over before his servant, and I will lead on softly, according as the cattle that goeth before me, and the children be able to endure until I come unto my Lord unto Seir." And so anyway, he was just basically saying he couldn't drive the animals very fast, and so he wanted time. And it goes on to say in verse 15 that Esau said, Let me now leave with thee some of the folk that are with me. And he said, What needeth it? Let me find grace in thy sight, my Lord. And again, Esau has gone way beyond just not executing the judgment on him and killing him, but now he's even offering to take some of the army that he brought with him and use them to protect Jacob and his family and flocks as they're traveling. And Jacob said it wasn't necessary. And so, verse 16, "So Esau returned that day on his way unto Seir." You know, Mount Seir, and Seir is down to the south, way south of Israel, and it's where Petra is. Petra was a part of Seir, and it'll go on to say in the next chapter when it starts listing all the dukes that Esau produced, it will mention these things, and Petra was a part of that. So if you've ever seen pictures of Petra, probably it's best known by being part of the Harrison Ford Ark of the Covenant series. And this is where they went in and they used that place there in Petra. I forgot which one of those it was. I'm not a great movie guy. So anyway, in verse 17, it says, "And Jacob journeyed to Succoth and built him an house and made booths for his cattle. Therefore the name of the place is called Succoth," which that means booths. And so to build a house and stables for all of your animals takes time. So this implies that he lived for quite a bit of time in this area of Succoth, which is just right around the Jordan River. I think it's just east of the Jordan River. And that's where he dwelt for a period of time. Later, you'll find some passages here that imply that Esau and Jacob probably lived together for a brief period of time. It doesn't give us all of the details of that. In verse 18, it says, "And Jacob came to Salem, a city of Shechem, which is in the land of Canaan, when he came from Padan Aram and pitched his tent before the city." This Shalem is also, most of the commentators believe that this was just another name for Jerusalem. It was an early name for Jerusalem. And the word literally means peaceful. So there are other commentators that believe that when it says he came to Shalem, which means peaceful, there are some commentators that believe this isn't talking about a place, but it's just saying that he came peacefully to Shechem, this place where he lived for a while. In verse 19, it says, "And he bought a parcel of a field which he had, where he had spread his tent at the hand of the children of Hamor, Shechem's father, for 100 pieces of money." So if you'll remember, when Abraham came into the promised land, the only land he ever owned was down in Hebron, and he bought a place where he buried Sarah, and then Abraham was buried there, and then Isaac and Rebekah were buried there, and eventually Jacob, or Israel, was buried there. But that was the only piece of land that they had in the promised land for decades. Now, this is the second piece of land. Jacob bought it, and it was just a small piece of land outside of this town of Shechem. And in the next chapter, what happened at Shechem is amazing. In verse 20, it says, "And he erected there an altar and called it," and again, I'm going to struggle with this name, Israel, and it means the God of Israel. And so again, this is reflective of how Jacob had changed over those 20 years when he was in Syria, and then the Lord appearing to him in a dream, telling him to come back. He saw the the host of the Lord's angels as he was coming back to the promised land. He wrestled with this angel, and now he has become a changed man, and he's naming places after his relationship with God. And that name means the mighty God of Israel, which was the name given to him by this man that he wrestled with. And so that brings us to the end of the 33rd chapter. That was a relatively short chapter compared to some, and I only have 1,156 more chapters to go.